Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Veronica Martinez, and I'm a professor of law and director of the Notre Dame Law School's program on ethics, compliance, and inclusion. I am so excited to be moderating today's discussion. This is the third session of our Bridging the Divide speaker series, hosted by the University of Notre Dame's Provost's Office in partnership with the Clough Center for Civil and Human Rights and the Rooney Center for the Study of American Democracy. The aim of this series is to promote thoughtful conversations on important issues as we approach the November 3rd presidential election. The first session in this series explored how we can promote civil discourse, even on issues for which we disagree deeply. And the second session focused on political polarization in America. And today's session will focus on exploring racial and social injustice and inequality in America. Regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum, it is imperative that we affirm and reinforce the norm of respecting the opinions of others in an effort to promote meaningful conversations about issues that can sometimes feel divisive. These are very challenging times for our nation, even as we adapt and adjust to the impacts of the global COVID-19 pandemic. Our nation's long history of racial and social injustice and inequality is once again front and center in the minds of all Americans. The death of George Floyd at the hands of police, like others before him and since, illustrates how far we have to go in creating a society that provides equal justice and equal opportunities for all of its citizens. We at Notre Dame have an important role to play in providing an education that seeks to create a more just, peaceful, and equitable world, and hosting discussions such as this to help us better understand and address these issues. This session will explore some of these racial and social inequalities and injustices, some of the long-standing reasons and factors that contribute to them, and possibly some ways to address some of them in meaningful ways. Joining us for this conversation are David Hooker, Associate Professor of the Practice of Conflict, Transformation, and Peacebuilding at the Keough School of Global Affairs. His expertise includes public policy and social justice, environmental justice, multi-party conflicts, negotiation, mediation, and post-conflict community building. We also have James Sullivan, Gilbert F. Schaefer Professor of Economics, and co-founder of the Wilson Sheehan Lab for Economic Opportunities, known here on campus as LEO. His research looks at the effectiveness of anti-poverty programs at the national, state, and local level. He also studies the consumption, saving, and borrowing behavior of poor households, as well as poverty and inequality measurement. Throughout the discussion, we welcome your comments or questions using the tab on the Think ND page. David and Jim, thank you so much for joining us. So we're going to start by learning what sparked your interest in researching issues relating to injustice and inequality within American society. Jim, let's start with you.
Thank you, Veronica. Well, I'm a Notre Dame alum, and I really think my interest in inequality and social justice grew out of my undergraduate experience here at Notre Dame, both what I learned in the classroom and my activities outside of class. When I was here, interest in issues related to social injustice ran deep, and those interests are still very alive today here on campus. And if I were to point to like one formative experience, it was probably my involvement in the Big Brother, Big Sister program when I was an undergrad here. And I was paired with a young boy who lived on the west side of South Bend in a very poor neighborhood. And I'll never forget the first time I went to pick him up. I was struck by the bullet hole in his front door, and then I walk in and they're heating the house with the kitchen oven, having the door open. And what struck me most about that was that this young boy, to no fault of his own, was given much less opportunity to thrive than I myself had been given. And that created a curiosity in me about what can be done. And so I grew an interest in trying to study policies that can improve outcomes for vulnerable populations. And that was why I was an economics major at Notre Dame and went on to study economics in graduate school. So out of graduate school, most of my research early on was on evaluating the effect of anti-poverty programs at the federal level. So this was during a time when we were reforming welfare, for example. And so much of my work was studying the impact of that on vulnerable populations. But more recently, my work has been with the center you mentioned, LEO, where we're partnering with local nonprofits to better understand the impact of the work they are doing on the most vulnerable among us. We partner with local nonprofit agencies like a Catholic Charities or Goodwill. And our hope is that by generating this evidence on which programs are the most effective, we can really go a long ways at addressing the inequities that we're talking about.
Fantastic. That's really interesting how your time here at Notre Dame ended up being formative in your current research path. David, what sparked your interest in researching issues related to injustice and inequality?
This was long before, my interest began long before I even thought about researching. My parents are from Moultrie, Georgia. They moved to Cincinnati, Ohio because the lack of opportunities, but we spent the lack of professional opportunities for college educated African Americans. We spent every summer in Moultrie, my cousins, my siblings and I all. And so we got a chance to see the difference between what was possible for us in Cincinnati and what was possible for us in what was not possible for us in Moultrie in terms of where we could go, the access to certain what I would think would be just regular societal benefits like access to a particular library or things like that. So, and then watching my parents, my mother was an educator and strongly involved in education reform and trying to get the kind of resources necessary for children in Black and brown neighborhoods. My father was a police officer, but was part of the police reform, recognizing the racialized nature of policing in the community. And so even while he was a police officer, he was constantly telling us about the need for the struggle for justice. And so then I went off and went to college at Morehouse College, and the commitment in Morehouse is to build a better world for those, to lift as we climb and to build a better world. And so I've been at this for a long time. It just so happened that I was able to attach mental health and public health and law and conflict transformation as theoretical frameworks for the commitment that I've had since I was a child to building a world that's open and available to everybody without arbitrary exclusion.
Thank you so much, David. So we're going to have a discussion surrounding a few broad questions tonight. And my first question that I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on is sparked in part by the death of George Floyd. So the death of George Floyd has sparked a reckoning across the United States focused on the many different ways in which people of color, and in particular Black people, have been marginalized within US society. One area that has received renewed attention is the topic of income inequality within the United States. David, could you discuss some of the historical sources of income and wealth inequality within the United States across racial demographic groups?
So the first thing always to think about, if you think about the economy in the United States, is to recognize it is racialized capitalism. The land, which was the basis for and access to the means of production, was stolen land, uncompensated from the people who originally occupied it. The labor for more than 200 years was uncompensated labor. But for many people, that feels like it's a long way ago. If you look at policies, more modern policies that have contributed to wealth divisions and inequalities, you can just look at the exclusion of African-American soldiers from GI Bill, the benefits associated with housing and education, and then the exclusion of African-American farmers from the agricultural loan programs that often were necessary for farmers to retain their land from planting season to planting season. And so 92% of previously owned land, agricultural land by African Americans has been lost during that period, and home ownership and everything that goes along with it, the wealth building possibilities have also been lost.
Okay. Jim, why have we seen such a sharp rise in income inequality in the US over, let's say, the past 40 years?
Yeah, so there's really a large number of contributing factors, probably more than I can go into in this conversation. Some of them are systemic. David mentioned some of these factors. Discrimination in the labor market and elsewhere certainly plays a role. Decline in the power of unionization plays a role. Competition through immigration plays a role. But really, there's growing consensus around perhaps the largest contributor to the sharp rise in earnings inequality that we've seen, particularly since the late 70s and has persisted, is due to what economists call skill-biased technological change. Now, that sounds like a technical thing, but it's really a simple idea. So we've had incredible advances in technology over the past several decades. And that technology has not been neutral in the sense that there are some winners and some losers. And it turns out that the nature of this technology, and not all technological change has to be this way, but the nature of this technological change that we've experienced has rewarded high-skilled workers in the sense that there's more demand for them, and penalized low-skilled workers, that there's less demand for them. And what's happening is the technology is replacing these low-skilled jobs. An easy example would be, when I was an undergrad at Notre Dame, I grew up in Chicago, and I would drive along the toll road, and I would meet a toll booth operator along the way and hand that person my toll. Nowadays, I have an iPass, and that iPass I find incredibly convenient. It has displaced a lot of jobs, right? And it also has created a lot of jobs in the sense that we need people with technical skills to develop that kind of technology and improve on it. So as a result, we have winners and losers. And it's really important to understand this as a contributor, a driving factor for rising income inequality, because that speaks to what we should be doing about it, right? There are groups that have been disproportionately affected by this, and policy really needs to be thinking about ways that it can account or address the excess price that these groups are paying.
Just to follow up a little bit more, David, do you have any thoughts on why we might see communities of color not being as active in the high-skilled labor market versus the low-skilled labor market?
Sure. So it actually is a compounding effect of some of those early decisions related to access to home ownership, because home ownership is the basis from which public schools are funded through the tax provisions. And so when you have disparate values of home ownership, then you have unfunded or underfunded schools, which means that the children in those schools have less access to technology, which means they have less access and exposure early on to the foundational apparatus necessary to move them into the kind of high-tech aspects. And so even if they are able to get through their high school and move into community colleges and into undergraduates, if they have a foundational lack of exposure, it's a compounding effect. And so you see some programs trying to mitigate that, but there is a widespread, ubiquitous problem that is based in the compounding effects and the aftermath of earlier policy decisions like this GI Bill exclusion that I was talking about before.
Okay, so if I'm following, we have historical structural differences in the way communities of color have access to things like home ownership, which then is connected to things like educational quality, which then starts running up against some of Jim's research surrounding how that then translates into income inequality today.
Right.
And so all of these different things that might seem a little bit random are actually quite connected to some of the economic disparities we're seeing on the ground today.
There absolutely is a continuing connection and a web between all of them.
And one of the things that I might add to that is just that there's a lot of research showing that a lack of opportunities at a very young age has a lifelong impact. So if these kinds of opportunities in terms of, say, high quality early childhood education are not available to certain demographic groups, they're going to be paying a price throughout their lifetime.
Okay, all right. Okay, so we're going to move on to our next question, our discussion area. So let's move on to COVID-19, which is impacting all of our lives. In fact, that's why we're all in different offices on the same university campus right now. So the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has hit communities of color particularly hard. Jim, I believe you have been researching the economic impacts of the pandemic. How specifically has your research brought to light the ways in which the pandemic has caused differing impacts on communities of color? Additionally, how might the government adjust its response to respond to these realities?
Sure. So what we did, myself and some colleagues at the University of Chicago, was we recognized that the census collects information on employment every month. That's where we get our monthly unemployment statistics. And in that same survey, they ask a question about family income. So what we do is use those data to measure poverty on a monthly basis, which is something that just simply hasn't been done before. And maybe wasn't so critical to have such real-time information on poverty in a non-pandemic world, but in a world where things are changing so rapidly and it's important to understand who's paying a price, this information becomes really important. So each month we've estimated what's happening to poverty in the United States. And there's some really interesting results. So shortly after the start of the pandemic, so in April, May, and June, we saw a sharp decline in poverty. Poverty fell by 1.5 percentage points. That's lifting 4.5 million individuals out of poverty. And you might ask, how is it that a pandemic is good for declines in poverty? And what we had was an unprecedented government response that included stimulus payments as well as expanded unemployment insurance benefits that at least temporarily put additional resources into the families and individuals, particularly at the bottom of the distribution. But then further, as we look out, so we've updated these numbers for recent months. And what we're finding for August and September is that poverty has risen. In fact, that entire decline has been erased, which also is not that surprising because much of the government relief package was either temporary or has expired. And one group, which groups are hit the hardest, the demographic group that's experienced the largest rise in poverty since July has been the Black and brown community, and where we've seen poverty rise by 5 percentage points. And this kind of information is really important as we're trying to think about what should the government do next. I think one, it's pretty clear to forecast that poverty is going to continue to rise if the labor market doesn't improve where it is today, or if the federal government doesn't act. So it does call for some action, but I think it also calls for particular targeting of any kind of relief package, because there are some clear winners and losers as a result of the pandemic. Certain industries have benefited. Big box retailers have done quite well. Small box retailers have not done well at all. And certain demographic groups are disproportionately represented in these industries and occupations that have been particularly hurt by the pandemic.
I see. Okay. So David, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit on why you think race has played such a significant role in the pandemic's effect on people across this country, obviously taking into account the research that Jim has been doing.
So one of the things that I think is important, and I want to build on what Jim was saying about the measure of poverty, like the idea that one $1,200 check or a continuing $600 every other week actually lifts people out of poverty is probably suggesting that we could rethink the measures, because it may be that temporarily, for the purposes of a week or two, they're able to have access to a moderate to subsistence living, but I don't know that that actually removed them from the experience of poverty, the precarity that comes with the lack of access to sustaining resources. And so, but I think that one of the other factors is because of the way that communities and society to a great extent in the United States is still very segregated. It's multiple, it's a multiplication effect, because it's not just that one individual lacks access, but in a network where you have an entire network where you don't necessarily have excess resources in some portion of the network or some other portion of the network, and those networks are being frayed and destroyed all the time. And so the experience of precarity is is impacting multiple people within the same network, family, communal system at the same time, which has kind of an amplifying effect. And then the small businesses that were located in those areas, because business often leaves those areas first. And so when the businesses leave, then even the small circulation of money that would be happening is leaving. And so it's a kind of a multiplying, a geometric impact because of the precarity within the entire network.
Okay, so because certain communities are being hit harder, and it's not just me, it's me and my aunt and my cousin and my nephew,
Right.
all at the same time, and then that's exacerbating the experience of poverty.
And can I add one other piece to that?
Sure.
And one other piece of that is that some of the other infrastructure that may, in fact, mitigate some of that is also, it shows up where the infrastructure is not there. So it's not just that opportunity is racialized. John Powell talks about opportunity being spatialized, so that the people who need work are often separated from or distanced from access to it, and without substantial transportation networks, then they get impacted even more so. And so there are a number of infrastructure kinds of complications that add into the experience of precarity.
Okay, so this is one of the things that I love about the academic life. We're talking about poverty, but we're not talking about quite the same thing. So Jim, when you say poverty, what is your definition of poverty?
Yeah, so there, I think David makes a good point that income-based poverty doesn't necessarily translate into well-being. In fact, I've done a lot of work. Much of my work has been on consumption-based measures of poverty, which will do a much better job of capturing the current economic circumstances of an individual. And in fact, if you look at consumption during the pandemic, we don't have it at the individual level, but you can see that consumption fell sharply when the pandemic hit, even as income went up. Mm-hmm. And so what that speaks to the anxiety that David was referring to. What's happening is individuals have these economic resources, but what they don't have is certainty about the future. Mm-hmm. So are they going to lose their job, or are they not going to be able to find a job in the future? And because of that uncertainty, they're reining in their spending, because they might need that to even put food on the table. And that's why we see things like longer lines at food pantries and greater need of social services.
Right. So even if the government does come in and do some more targeted, let's say, stimulus payments or things of that nature, which would be helpful, it sounds like, under either framework of poverty we're looking at, because certain communities are more vulnerable, in particular Black and Brown communities appear to be more vulnerable right now, that's still not going to do enough to deal with the broader issue. So we can deal with kind of the effects of that COVID-19 has exacerbated, that we still have larger concerns about income inequality and poverty, which is what Leo is working on all the time. And so we shouldn't forget those broader issues as we're going forward. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. I also think that we're talking about COVID-19s, we're talking about health, and health is wealth. And so when you have communities that have much broader exposure to environmental conditions, less access to health, more pre-existing conditions, and tend to use hospitals more for their routine care and hospital attached clinics for their routine care. And then when COVID hit, and so there were all of those kind of accesses were kind of slowed down or stopped, full stop. So then you have increasing impacts of these existing and pre-existing health kinds of conditions. And so those health disparities then are going to multiply, add up, and then when you attach that to the inability to have access to the necessary insurance coverage and so forth, then it kind of multiplies. And so there are people who may be able to have a meal, but when they're choosing between the meal for themselves and their children and paying for preventive care or maintenance for chronic conditions, we know that precarity is just beneath the surface, even if it can't be measured by some of the consumption models and other ways of thinking about the economy.
Okay, you know what, David, I think that lets us flow right into our next discussion topic, which is, why does the concept of race continue to be a distinguishing factor in so many areas of American life?
Yeah, so it should be a conundrum because race is a fiction, right? So race isn't actually a thing, but other than an explanatory factor, there's no biological basis for race. So race just operates as an explanatory factor for the distribution of access to wealth and privileges and access to resources and kind of status and value, testimonial authority within the society. And that race gets assigned. So we often think as though these are immutable characteristics. Those who are white have always been white. It's just not so. People were once not white. Irish and Italians and some others came here and they weren't white and they had to get incorporated into that category at some point. Arabs at some point were white. After 9/11, we changed the census so that we didn't keep making that challenge, that became challenging. And but particularly Blackness, and even in the pan-Latinx spectrum, some people, because racism is about the distribution of power and privileges and access, is based on the value that we place on people's lives according to the way they look. Racism is durable because it's flexible, because it's allowed to accommodate changes, and people get assigned or assume particular racial categories. We've seen a couple of professors who for a while actually benefited from being Black, and so they took advantage of that. And then at some point they thought, this Blackness thing is really going on, so I'm going to bail on this and just come clean on the fact that I've been playing Black for a while. And so it's a movable character, but it's oppression is resilient. And so it continues to find ways to incorporate people and assign them as an explanatory for the distribution of privileges and authority within the country.
Jim, you direct a research center, you direct LEO, that works with nonprofits to find effective ways to move people out of poverty. From this research, what has LEO learned about addressing social and racial inequities in this country?
Yeah, so we work with nonprofits all across the country and in a number of different focus areas that maybe collectively you could describe as efforts to move people permanently out of poverty. And perhaps one of the more important takeaways that maybe seems obvious, but our policies don't necessarily reflect this, is that poverty is really complicated. So the reasons why individuals are poor and why they can't get out of poverty is really complicated. So we've been talking a lot about some structural issues and fundamental racism that certainly plays a contributing factor. mismatch of skills, that the skills an individual has don't align with what's needed in the local labor market. Health, as David mentioned, is clearly an important factor with poverty, but also access to childcare and other factors that arise in your life. And this has come up with time and time again with our Leo studies, because many nonprofits recognize this, and they're trying to ask the question, well, given that, how do we help people move to a point where they're no longer in poverty? And so recognizing the complexity of poverty, they've designed programs where there's really growing evidence of promise, that are much more holistic in nature. So rather than say just giving cash or giving in-kind benefits, you step back and ask the question, well, why are you in this situation in the first place? So let's suppose the diagnosis initially is that there's a skill mismatch, that your skills are no longer in high demand in the community. Then you work with your case manager to come up with an action plan. So you might be, in this case, it might be, well, we're going to get a certificate to be a welder because there's lots of demand in the community for that particular skill. And then importantly, a case manager will walk with that individual or family through their journey out of poverty, because what happens due to the complexity of poverty is that life gets in the way. They go and they start a certificate program, and then they lose their childcare and they have to drop out of the certificate program. We're very successful at sending individuals to community colleges all across the country. We're much less successful at getting them to cross the finish line and complete a degree. Why? Because life gets in the way. And these kinds of comprehensive case management programs have been shown to be quite effective at improving outcomes. So at Leo, what we do is we've built randomized controlled trial impact evaluations where we're comparing people who receive these services to those who don't, and showing that we're seeing remarkably improved outcomes in terms of employment and earnings and even health and other outcomes. And so I think it's a promising model for having a more sustained impact on these problems that we've talked about.
You know, the thread that connects between both of your comments in response to this discussion question is that it's complex, right? Mm-hmm. So issues of race are super complex in this environment. David, you did a little hint there to Afro-Latino culture. My married name is Martinez, but some people think I'm Dominican, and some people think, don't know what to make of me. And they make all sorts of assumptions, and that happens all the time, but identity is complex. Mm-hmm. But these issues surrounding poverty, like how do you really help someone? Mm-hmm. How do you see them as a full and complete person with dignity is also super complex. And so part of what's happening in America right now is we are seeing the ways in which the complexities surrounding race and the complexities surrounding economic justice are intersecting. And they're intersecting in the public eye in a really remarkable way, and hopefully in a way that is going to allow for there to be meaningful change going forward, that we can think through, like organizations like Leo and research like what David is doing, that hopefully we can think through ways we can make tangible differences in this world, that we can fight for all members of our society in an effort to restore everyone's dignity, and the dignity of work, and the dignity of just living a good life. So my last question for you each, and this conversation has been really fantastic, is if you could do anything, what one thing might you like to see happen or implemented to address racial and social injustice and inequality within America? Let's start with you, Jim.
Yeah, so thinking big, if you'll allow me, I think I would like to see significant investments in early childhood experiences so that every child has the equal opportunity to flourish and thrive. So I think of my little brother in South Bend, him having the opportunities to succeed. The research shows that investments early on in life pay these long-term dividends, and we currently don't have that equality of opportunity. So if you think about the income distribution and look at children that are born into the bottom fifth of the income distribution. If we had equality of opportunity, they would be equally likely to land anywhere in the distribution when they grow up. And only 20% chance of being in the bottom fifth, right? But in actuality, we see that poor and children who grow up poor are much more likely to end up poor when they're adults. And there's a huge racial disparity there, that actually white children are almost at equal opportunity, in the sense that there's just a little over a 20% chance that they end up in the bottom income part of the quintile, bottom fifth of the income distribution, if they grew up there. Whereas Black and brown children are more than 50% chance that if they grew up in a family that was in the bottom fifth of income, that they too will land there. And so I think a lot needs to be done to create equal opportunities for children to thrive.
Great. David?
So I want to even take a step back further. I want to think a little bigger than that. We have to acknowledge that the systems, the structures, the policies, the laws aren't things that just happen on their own. They align with a particular narrative. And so not just stepping back to the policy level to give children the opportunity for equal dignity, but stepping back further, how do we shift the narrative in the country to the notion that everybody should have equal dignity? Like everybody is, because we have this narrative that suggests that people don't have it, and many of them don't have it because of something that they did or some aspect of who they are. And so if we start with the basis that everybody should be given equal dignity, then we look and we notice when education systems and justice systems and health systems and other systems and structures are impeding their access to that dignity and testimonial authority. So how do we step back and build a narrative in this country that says that everybody, regardless of the zip code in which they are born, deserves full and fundamental access to the resources, relationships, opportunities, testimonial authority that they need to survive, to thrive, and to offer, to manifest their full capabilities, offering contribution to the greater good of the country and the world. When do we shift that narrative? And to begin shifting that narrative, we have to tell the truth about how we got here.
Okay. Thank you so much, both of you, for this great discussion thus far. I'm now going to turn to some of the questions that have come in as we've been speaking, and there have been a variety, so I don't know that I'll get to all of them. But I'm going to start with the following question. So, absent new interventions, will the economic divide continue to expand? And what might be done to change that trajectory? Jim and David, what do you think regarding that?
After, say the question again, after?
Absent new interventions.
Oh, absent new interventions, sure.
I'm sorry, absent new interventions, will the economic divide continue to expand? And what can be done to change the trajectory?
So I'm happy to take a stab at that. You know, because when we talked about the underlying factors that contribute to growing inequality, absent any change, right, we're likely to see these disparities persist or even increase. I mean, we will surely see continued technological change, and so if there aren't policies to help address those that pay the heavy price because of technological advancement, then we're going to continue to see people whose wages are stagnant or even fall as a result of technological change. And the same goes for you know, children who grow up in poor neighborhoods and don't have access to quality schooling or nourishing, enriching environment at a young age. Absent of doing something to really address that more than we're doing today, means that those disparities could persist or even get worse, because you know, what's happening at the high end of the distribution is, you know, continuous improvement and in terms of quality of education and experiences for children and young adults.
Yeah,
David, go ahead.
Absent any intervention, I mean, let's look just a little further out. Absent any intervention, the United States as we know it collapses, right? Like we achieve a tipping point of inequality, and what all of the peace research will tell you is that the primary cause of societal degradation isn't poverty, it's inequality. And so we are approaching, we are approximating, we are beginning to achieve a tipping point. And so absent any intervention at all, we are thinking that we're in the midst of some serious change in our understanding of what it means to be a United States.
So I guess I'm a little more hopeful than that, simply because we have seen some improvements. So most of the inequality, for example, is at the very top of the distribution. So we're seeing rises in inequality that occur at the very top relative to, say, people who are just high income. A bulk of it is between the top and the middle, not so much when you compare, say, the middle of the distribution to those at the bottom. And we've also seen overall encouraging economic news that the pandemic is kind of overshadowed. So we've seen for a long period of time declines in poverty and improvements in economic well-being at the bottom of the distribution. And that kind of progress, I think, gives me some reason to be hopeful that we never get to the situation David's talking about.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to our next question, which is also related to inequality. In terms of the causes of inequality, the focus was great, but mostly seemed to be about African Americans. Would you please explain the pervasive causes and cures of inequality among Latinx Americans, particularly immigrants? Would your assessments change at all?
My sense is that the structure of the economy has there are ways in which it is racialized. And so that's not just black and white, it's racialized. And so there are different groups that are segmented in their access to work, to health, to housing, to all of those things. All of those things are interconnected in ways that, because society is segmented by identity, United States is segmented in so many places by identity, and those separations are becoming more stark, then similar kinds of factors in the system will impact Latinx, and particularly those who are identifiably Latinx, as opposed to those who have more fluid positionality.
So I'm really glad this question was asked, because I did mention immigration in the context of explaining increases in income inequality. And really there's been a lot of work on this, because one of the rationales for opposing immigration and opposing more refugees is that they are competing for low-skilled jobs and driving down wages for Native Americans. And so there's been a lot of work looking into how much does immigration and refugees really do play in keeping wages low for Natives. And there's there's a big debate in economics about this, but the debate is really between, is it no effect or is it a really small effect? And so one thing that I think we've learned is that when new immigrants arrive to a community, or additional refugees arrive to a community, they're not a drain on wages by providing too much supply for skilled workers. Rather, they're also consuming and active members of the economy, which ends up being a benefit for the community.
Okay. Our next question is, what is the connection, if any, between economic inequality and the disparities we see in the criminal justice system? David, maybe you could start there.
Well, certainly there's some economic connection, because there are some aspects of really substantial poverty, like deep poverty, that are pathologized and criminalized. And so there are ways in which existing at the edge and the margins of the economy are often criminalized. But it's also the case that poor communities, poorer and Blacker and brown communities, are over policed and are placed into disproportionately high contact with justice systems as juveniles, which is the highest predictor of whether you will have adult connection to the system. So they talk about, you've heard talk of a, school to prison pipeline, and there are ways in which early exposure to justice systems impact that. And then you've got all the other things, the money bail. Like if you get arrested on a small traffic stop or something like that, and you need bail, but you don't have the money to bail yourself out, in addition to not having the money to pay for healthcare, you don't have the money to get yourself out of jail, which then spirals. You lose your job, you lose you lose your housing, and so then it has a compounding effect, which places you more likely in the system. And then those coming out, also the collateral consequences of incarceration are expansive. The number of jobs and employment arenas that you no longer have access to, the second-class citizenship that is cast upon you for much of the rest of your life is substantial. And so it creates a cycle of connection to the justice system. And finally, much of the justice system has been privatized, and the only way that private prisons and private correction actually make a profit, which is good for a lot of us, like those at Notre Dame who have private prisons as part of their pension system, has an investment in private prisons as part of their pension system. We don't say anything because the private prisons, but in order for a private prison to make profit, people need to keep coming back. They need clientele. And so the system is based on recidivism.
Jim, did you have any?
Yeah, so, one benefit of working with nonprofits all across the country is that you get a good sense of what are the problems on the front lines. And so when you talk to nonprofit social service providers and ask them to, what are the programs that are most in need? What are the urgent needs in your community? Many of them talk about criminal justice initiatives, and in particular prisoner reentry programs. Because that's just a fundamental problem that many are facing. We incarcerated a large number of individuals a few decades ago, and now we're letting them out at high rates. And as David mentioned, they are facing many barriers to self-sufficiency. And so it's going to be critically important. And so I think it just gives rise to concerns about worse inequality going forward. Is if you don't provide opportunities for these individuals, their chances to succeed are diminished considerably.
Okay. So our next question is, to what degree does transformation of racial and social inequalities belong at the federal or local level? In other words, which is more impactful, grassroots efforts or federal policy and spending? Jim, let's start with you.
Sure. The advantage of a federal policy is the dollars behind it are going to be much larger. But I'm going to say you got to start with the local level. And the reason why I support these grassroots movements, maybe not surprising because I'm working with these nonprofits at the local level, is it's tied to this idea of the complex nature of poverty that we talked about, right? Every community is facing different unique needs amongst their population. There are certain factors that are going to play a role and others not. Nobody understands more how to address those needs than those that are serving vulnerable populations on the front lines. And so I think that the design of policies and programs to address these disparities should come at the local level. And then that information needs to be, we test that, we understand what's effective and what's not. And that information trickles up to the federal level for programs that have been shown to replicate and scale, to have broad impact nationally, you really need the backing of federal programs.
And so I would think that it's not either or, it's both and. Like certainly the funding has the benefit of coming from the federal, and it's not really even like local. Like poverty has a regional, it's complex and it has regional implications, which is why in a lot of areas, like I lived in Atlanta for 20 years, and Atlanta's not the only place, but there are many places that have what are called regional commissions, because these are the kinds of issues that don't recognize the local jurisdictional borders. And so you have to have kind of regional approaches, multiple counties, and sometimes those multiple counties cross state lines, but you have an economic and social region that can attack the problems because they're so complicated. They need multiple players and can't be defined at just those local jurisdictional arbitrary lines.
Great. Our next and our final question is, how can we and the country maintain focus and attention on issues of racial and economic injustice and inequality at a time of increased polarization within our communities? So how can we work past what might seem to be certain difficulties in political realities to achieve a greater equality and justice within society? David, why don't we start with you?
So we are in a moment of turmoil because we are trying to renegotiate that phrase, we the people, right? Like we the people, when it was first stated, didn't include everybody. And so right now, this whole series on the need for political discourse, the need for engagement is so important and appropriate, because we have to renegotiate the identity of the nation, which then trickles to renegotiate the identity of the individuals and the communities, which were once placed in a particular hierarchy. But that hierarchy, those hierarchies are shifting, and they should shift and not be based on arbitrary features like race and gender and zip code and things like that. And so we're in the midst of a very difficult time. And what's actually going to be required, a lot of people are asking for these conversations to be safe, and safe space is not, now is not the time for safe space, because safe space is limited in its capacity to the most sensitive among us. What we need is brave space, those who are willing to step courageously into the reimagination of something that we can't see on the other side, but we know is absolutely necessary. We have to move ourselves into what I call humanity 3.0, and that's going to take some work and difficult time and taking the risk to coexist with those that we previously have not had either reason or desire to.
Jim, any thoughts on this?
Sure. I guess I'm a bit of an optimist here when there's not a lot of evidence to be an optimist. Why? Well, there are some examples that our policymakers can work together to address needs when there's real urgency. The CARES Act, we passed a $3 trillion piece of legislation, and the IRS sent out 160 million checks in the matter of weeks, and we transferred hundreds of millions of dollars to households in need in a short period of time, and that was bipartisan legislation. Now, we probably are in need of something again, and it's less clear whether or not they're going to be able to do that in a timely fashion. But we are also seeing consensus at the local level. So there's a lot of support around programs designed to improve outcomes for the disadvantaged. And I feel like if the federal government isn't going to get it done, that there's a lot of progress that can be done in the meantime at the local level. And the last reason why maybe I'm optimistic about policies that could help here is that when I talk to people on Capitol Hill about this, they say, there is a lot of compromise going on, and there is a lot of legislation being passed. It's just in this day and age of social media, it's not interesting to tweet about the compromise on a small bill. It's just much more interesting to talk about division and disagreement. And I feel like sometimes it's this divisive nature that gets all the attention, and much of the progress that's Yeoman's work is falling under the radar.
Okay. Thank you both so much for this wonderful discussion. Obviously, there are so many other topics we could have gone through, and I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to everyone's questions. But I really want to thank David and Jim for taking the time to be with us this evening. And I want to take a little bit of David's brave space language. And just a reminder, you know, we are the Fighting Irish. I don't know if you can see my mug. And I want to encourage you to fight for those brave spaces. And that's what we're doing. That's what the Provost's office and the Klaus Center and all of us on campus are doing right now in an effort to promote greater civil discourse in a time of increased polarization within our country. So we hope that you can join us next Monday, October 19th, for the next event in this series, during which we will explore women's voting and the myth that all women vote similarly. For more information on the Bridging the Divide speaker series, please visit provost.nd.edu. And thank you again for joining us this evening.